The return of Darth Sidious, as depicted in The Rise of Skywalker, came as a massive surprise for Star Wars fans who had long understood the Emperor to be dead. Having been thrown down the ventilation shaft of the Death Star, which imploded just moments later, there appeared to be no room for the Emperor to escape. But as is often the case with Darth Sidious, everything was not what it seemed. Calling on his dark powers, Palpatine executed his contingency plan, thrusting his very consciousness into a clone body on Exegol. The Emperor's new existence was provisional, restrictive, and excruciatingly painful, but he had survived, leaving his body an empty vessel long before it reached the bottom of the Death Star's shaft. Over 30 years would pass before the Dark Lord revealed himself to the galaxy once again, suddenly raising the stakes of the current war beyond measure, as the most devastating force the galaxy had ever known threatened to return. But the question we are interested in for today's video is whether or not this revelation defeats the purpose of Anakin's sacrifice in Return of the Jedi. Once a great Jedi Knight, deemed the Chosen One who was destined to destroy the Sith and bring balance to the Force, Anakin fell to the dark side and became Darth Vader. In the end, however, Skywalker would renounce his Sith title, betraying Darth Sidious, defeating him to save his son, and thus fulfilling the prophecy of the Chosen One after all. But Palpatine's threat to return once more in Episode 9 gave rise to discussions about how this change may impact Anakin's final act in Return of the Jedi. So, I ask again, was the purpose of Anakin's sacrifice nullified by Palpatine's return? My answer? No, it wasn't, and here's why. The purpose of Anakin's sacrifice was to save his son, and he did that. And it was through that act that Anakin himself was redeemed. This moment was always about Luke and Anakin. Palpatine's death and the destruction of the Sith were simply consequences of Anakin's sacrifice. Those were things that needed to happen in order for Anakin to accomplish what he needed to accomplish, but they were never the purpose behind what he did, nor were they the driving force behind the story. The villains needed to fall for the heroes to win, but Anakin's sacrifice is always about him and his love for his son. So anything that happens with Palpatine after that is irrelevant to the ultimate theme of Return of the Jedi, which is the light prevailing over the dark. Now, if we reword this question slightly, the answer may become different. Rather than asking if Palpatine's survival defeats the purpose of Anakin's sacrifice, we can instead ask if it lessens the overall impact. And that is a very different question, because now we're no longer talking about why Anakin did what he did, we're talking about the effect of Anakin's actions on the galaxy at large within the context of the story. And the answer to that question, in my opinion, is a little more up for debate. It's subject to how broad of a scope you want to look at the story with. On one hand, I will concede that Palpatine's reemergence does muddy the water around the Chosen One prophecy, and it could possibly lower the gravity of Anakin's sacrifice a little bit, but I do have several counterpoints to that line of thinking. One, regardless of what happened down the road, Anakin destroyed the Sith and played an absolutely necessary hand in freeing the galaxy from Palpatine's tyranny. There were over 20 years of peace thanks to his return. So the impact of his sacrifice was gigantic, and it rippled across the stars. 2, Anakin remains the Chosen One despite the events of the sequel trilogy because the Sith never actually returned. They simply clung to existence in the shadows, kind of how they did before their emergence in and prior to the prequel trilogy. Only this time, their hope to re-emerge is more like them scratching and clawing at something that may or may not be there, versus in the prequel trilogy or before the prequel trilogy, it was a very calculated and well thought out plan that ultimately culminated in Darth Sidious taking the galaxy by storm. And then when Palpatine does attempt to rise again, as he successfully did before, he fails. He clearly says in The Rise of Skywalker, nothing will stop the return of the Sith. And then Rey stops the return of the Sith. So, Anakin destroyed the Sith, and then Rey upheld Anakin's legacy because she prevented their return. And then the final point, which I have discussed before, the events of the prequel trilogy really create a lot of potential for Palpatine to return from death, and I think him doing so in the sequel trilogy really just capitalizes on what was set up in the prequels. But at the end of the day, none of that really matters when we're assessing the original topic I raised in this video, which was the purpose behind Anakin's sacrifice, which again, ultimately boils down to the flickering light of Anakin Skywalker within Darth Vader, which erupted in those moments on the Death Star, as his son, who continued to believe in his father despite all the terrible things he'd done, cried out for his help. Palpatine's return doesn't change the fact that Anakin saved Luke. It doesn't change Anakin's redemption, and it doesn't even change the Chosen One prophecy. But what do you guys think? Even if you agree with me on this topic, that doesn't mean you have to love Palpatine's inclusion in the sequel trilogy by any means. It can make sense within the context of the story while still being a decision you wish hadn't been made. So leave your thoughts down below. Please try to keep it friendly. Remember that at the end of the day, these are just movies. There is more to life, and when you engage others in the comments section, you are talking to real people. But with that being said, I turn the conversation over to you guys. So thank you all for tuning in. I hope you have a fantastic day, and may the Force be with you always.